Hello and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things relating to your well-being, including interviews with experts in the fields of nutrition, physical and mental health, and my 5-minute food facts series. I am Amanda Hayes, your host, a lawyer turned nutritionist with a passion for well-being. You could say I'm on a personal odyssey to seek improvements on all areas of my life. Before I introduce today's guest, I will mention that, although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast is not intended to be used to treat, cure or prevent injuries or medical conditions and is not a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today I am here with Kym Burls, who is a certified Wim Hof Method instructor based here in Adelaide in South Australia. I assume that most people have heard something about the Wim Hof Method, but don't worry if you haven't, because I will be asking Kym to explain it to us and some of the scientific evidence behind it. Hi Kym, welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and look forward to diving a little bit deeper into the Wim Hof Method over the course of this podcast.
Yes, and as Kym and I were discussing off air, many people may have heard about Wim Hof, but not really understand what the whole method entails. So we will dive into that today and learn all about it. So first of all, I think, can you give us, Kym, a bit of a potted bio of Wim Hof? Who is he?
Sure. So he is a Dutch extreme athlete. He came into media, the attention of the media by breaking multiple world records for feats to do with cold exposure. So he did hold the record for the world's longest ice bath, which was 1 hour and 52 minutes. That's since been broken, amazingly. But he's also done things like climbing Mount Kilimanjaro in under 3 days. He has climbed up past the death zone, so where people normally use supplemental oxygen on Mount Everest, and where he really sort of first jumped into the media spotlight is through he ran a full marathon above the Arctic Circle in Finland. So he spent about 4.5 hours running around in board shorts and bare feet in minus 20.
As you do.
Yeah, exactly. So it was these feats that caught the attention of not only the media, but also research scientists around the world. And that was his aim. He was like, look, I think I have something here.
Yeah.
And I want to get science to study it, to look into me, to dissect it, to understand it, and then bring it to the world. And so that's what he's done. Since the first big important study came out in 2011, 2012, and since then he has been quite literally a man on a mission.
Yes, and we will hear more about everything involved in how he actually is able to perform these extraordinary feats. But first of all, Kym, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. So can you tell us a bit about your journey to practicing the Wim Hof Method? How did you find out about it, for example?
Yeah, sure. So in 2015, Vice Media did a documentary on Wim. They went through his breathing technique. They went to his house in Amsterdam and they went to his place in Poland and they dived deep and they did some really crazy things. And I happened to watch it. It didn't really sink in that seed didn't really germinate, but it was planted. And it wasn't until 2017 when I was going through a big period of change in my life. I was quite literally trying to do a 180 degree turn in my life. I was, unhealthy. I wasn't exercising. I was overweight, severely depressed. I just lost my job and a house that I was about to buy. And so, those little...
A perfect storm.
Correct.
Yeah.
All those external things that we hang a lot of value on all of a sudden got taken away.
Yeah.
And, I took a hard look at my life and, I realized that I was the sum of all the decisions I'd made up until that point. And then I was like, okay, if I don't like where I am, I need to make better decisions. So I did that 180-degree turn and decided to pack everything up. And went on I like to call it a bit of an eat, pray, love kind of trip.
Nice.
I decided to challenge myself physically, mentally and spiritually. So, the first part I spent a couple of months in Thailand, really training CrossFit, Muay Thai and really physically challenging myself. And I was looking for a mental challenge after that. And I remember the documentary, it came into my head and I was like, okay, my intention or my thought behind it was that I was going to go there and learn, mental toughness, mental grit, and do all these things.
Be a superhuman.
Correct, but more around from a toughness sort of thing. And what I soon realised is that the beauty of the Wim Hof Method and the success, for want of a better term, is not in that grit and toughness, but in actually surrendering and in letting go. It's quite literally, turned my life around.
And isn't it fascinating, Kym, that it has now actually become your work?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that certainly wasn't my intention. The thing that, first attracted me to it, look, it definitely wasn't the cold. I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. But it was the mental health aspect. And from that, it sort of grew and developed into a decision to share it with, people and teach it to people. Yeah, but the germination came from, helping myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then once you decided that you did want to share that with other people, what's the process for becoming certified?
Firstly, from my opinion, it's an important distinction between practicing and teaching. Just because you really enjoy something and it may have changed your life or greatly helped you doesn't necessarily mean that the decision to teach it to people is the right one. So first of all, take a look at your motivations and your reason behind doing it. That's sort of step one. But the thing I've enjoyed once you get over that is that as you develop and grow and do deep work, that not only does that benefit you, but it also benefits your teaching as well. So it's really a win-win. And for me, that was an important decision around, becoming a teacher, is that I continue to grow as well. So in terms of the steps involved, it takes approximately 12 months. So, you need to have already been practicing the Wim Hof Method for some time, being familiar with the breathing technique and the cold exposure in various ways as well, exploring and experimenting yourself. From there, there's an initial weekend training, which is sort of designed to teach you how to teach and introduce you to some of the theory. And then from there, it's a 6 to 9 month period of practicing in teaching yourself and doing in-depth research and study, followed by and sort of culminating in a week-long instructor retreat in Poland, which was incredible. And it sort of solidifies the past 12 months that you've been doing, and you really explore and essentially break apart little bits of yourself and then spend the rest of the week putting them back together in a just a slightly different order. So it's incredible.
That would have been fascinating, spending a week in Poland.
Yeah.
So is that where you actually met Wim?
So weirdly enough, my first foray into the Wim Hof Method wasn't with Wim. It was with another instructor, but we were lucky enough to do the retreat in Wim's house. So I first met Wim when I was working for them. So I was, fortunate enough to work in their head office in Amsterdam for a period of 6 months back in 2018. And so had a lot to do with Wim and with his family. So the Wim Hof Method is a family-run business, which was really, a beautiful opportunity to have had that.
Yeah, you're very lucky. Yeah. And what would you say, before we go into more depth about what the Wim Hof Method actually is, what has it brought to your life?
Without overstating it, it's actually brought me life. It's given me a whole suite of tools to approach life in a different way, to look at life in a different way. And, I don't just mean a change in career. I mean, deep emotional, physical, mental, spiritual changes and the opportunities that come through that, but also things like friendships, opportunities to do things like this podcast, to travel, and it's quite literally changed my life at almost every single level.
Isn't that amazing?
And I still, moments like this when I talk about it, I have to stop and think and be exceptionally grateful for having made that initial step to go and, put aside any doubts and fears I had in, what the heck is this?
Yes.
And quite literally jump into it. It's been incredible.
And what's amazing to me is that you went into it as a way to explore your mind. And really, as you say, it's become your life. It's the way you live, isn't it? It's more than just what you do. It's the way you approach your whole life. So you're lucky, but you're also, you created that situation and live it. But isn't that wonderful that your passion can also become your work?
Yeah, correct. And just before I answer that sort of, or talk about that comment, I think, I came across a quote from a friend of mine this week, where we are literally one decision away from having a completely different life. And, I was looking for a way to challenge myself mentally. I could have picked a whole host of other things, but I said yes to this opportunity.
Yes.
Looked at, sort of put aside any hesitation around the cold and the discomfort, because before I'd been practicing the Wim Hof Method, I was not a fan of the cold. I was the guy at the party, rugged up in everybody's jackets under 10 different layers, shivering in the corner. And, the cold was not my natural go-to place. And by just simply saying yes to an opportunity and what happens after that, and that's not just related to the Wim Hof Method, that is broadly in life in general. It's powerful stuff.
Oh, it's incredible. So I think it's probably a good time then to drill down into what the Wim Hof Method actually is. And what fascinates me about it is lately there's been an increased focus on sleep and on breathing, and they're things that we all do and we all take for granted. But a lot of us don't give them much thought. And the same can be said, I think, of the mind. So Buddhism is something that I am very interested in, and that is really about training the mind more than anything else. And it's becoming more and more popular in Western societies. So I think what's interesting about the Wim Hof Method is that a really fundamental part of it is about the breathing technique. So can you explain to us, before we talk specifically about that, what are the 3 pillars of the Wim Hof Method?
Sure. So contrary to what a lot of people might think, it isn't just purely about, doing crazy things in the cold and taking an ice bath. There are other aspects to it. So the method is comprised of 3 pillars. So it's a specialized breathing technique, gradual cold exposure, and then commitment mindset training. So, and it's the combination of those 3 things that make the Wim Hof Method, but it's also the combination of those 3 things that one enhances the other. And it's putting all those things together in practice that deliver the most benefit.
So in terms of putting it together in practice, let's talk first about the breathing technique. Can you tell us what that is? I mean, I know there's a lot to it, but just give us an outline essentially of what the Wim Hof technique the Wim Hof Method breathing technique is?
Sure. So there are 3 primary parts to it. You have the breathing component, you have the breath hold, breath retention component, and the recovery breath. So the first part, the breathing technique, comprises of 30 to 40 breaths taken slow, full, belly up into the chest, and then with a short, almost sigh-like exhale. Then when you get to your last breath, you take a full breath in, then empty the lungs, getting to a neutral lung. It's not about, really forcing that breath out, but you get to a neutral lung and then hold your breath. And then when you get the urge to breathe again, you're going to take one big, deep breath in, and you're going to hold that for 10 to 15 seconds. Then while you're doing that and holding your breath, just gently squeeze your pelvic floor, gently contract your pelvic floor muscles. And then at the end of that 10 to 15 seconds, you simply exhale. That is 1 round, and we just do multiple rounds. 3-4 rounds is a, dare I say, a normal practice in inverted commas.
I'll just mention that I met Kym when I went to one of his workshops here in Adelaide, and he guided us through this breathing technique, which was wonderful because one of the things that springs to mind is, how am I going to count to, 30 or 40 breaths? But Kym helps you through that. And there is also an app that you can use. So that's not as difficult as it sounds. The next pillar, the cold exposure, can you explain what that is to us?
Sure. So the cold exposure is around, first and foremost, reconnecting us back to nature, and also putting the body through what we call hormetic stress, a controlled stress. And it doesn't always have to be an ice bath. Mm-hmm. It can be any sort of cold exposure technique. So that could include a cold shower. It could be a dip in the ocean, preferably during wintertime. Summer, a little bit too warm here in Australia, in Adelaide. But it could also be as simple as putting your hands or your feet into a bucket of ice, or even what I like to do in wintertime is just go for a barefoot walk on the grass, or down to grab a coffee. It's about exposing the body to cold temperatures, exposing the body and yourself to discomfort as well, and harnessing the benefits that come from that.
Do you know what really interests me about that is that I think these days, us humans, certainly here in Australia, we're so comfortable. The minute it gets cold, the heater goes on. The minute it gets hot, the air conditioner goes on. We've got layers of clothes on. So our bodies are not used to being uncomfortable. And that's not really the way humans evolved, is it?
No, correct. So in the body, we have an incredible natural evolved temperature detection and temperature adjustment, essentially an internal thermostat in the hypothalamus. So when the body senses either a change in temperature, either an increase or decrease to external temperatures, internal, it adjusts. And exactly like you said, over time, we have insulated ourselves from all sorts of temperatures. Yeah, it could be hot, it could be cold. And so these evolutionary processes don't actually get to be used.
Be challenged, yeah.
Exactly. And beautiful. That is a fantastic description, is that challenging aspect. And that's what the Wim Hof Method is about. It's about challenging the body and forcing in a controlled way,
yes,
that adaptation and that growth and that return to natural processes.
And then the third pillar is the mindset or commitment. So what's that about, Kym?
Yeah, look, it's quite a literal thing. So that the cold is uncomfortable. It is a very powerful stressor on the body. One of the most powerful stressors that we have, because it impacts us in a strong physical way, but also mentally. And so a lot of people avoid it. Most people avoid it, and a few people are even completely afraid of it.
Yeah.
So to train in it, to train cold exposure in particular, you can't avoid the cold. You actually have to look at it, you have to face it and feel it. And you have to face what you've been avoiding. You have to face, the thing that you're afraid of. And that is incredibly beneficial for our growth.
Yes.
And it translates beautifully from, the ice bath out into broader life. It's a similar way, to imagine, you're training for a triathlon and you're doing specific exercises, not just to repeat those exercises, but the benefits they afford you in your real life, either in competition or you might be stretching so you move better. The same principle applies here. You train in order to reap the benefit of that in a broader context.
Yes, that's a good analogy, because training for something like a triathlon or any kind of sport, it's not just about the fitness. I think that whole mindset and commitment and, making yourself do something on the days you don't feel like it, it teaches you persistence. And that's an important quality, I think, to have in life.
Yeah.
So if somebody practices the Wim Hof Method and they are doing these 3 pillars, what are some of the health benefits then of combining all of those things?
Sure. So first and foremost, and I like to start with this one, it can help people overcome their fear of the cold. Mm-hmm. And from there, it has benefits around increasing energy. So in one of the first studies of Wim, they noticed that his metabolism had increased almost 200%, and he was using an absolute bucket load of oxygen during that breathing technique. So that first pillar, the breathing technique, can really help give us a sense of increased energy. It also has benefits around helping us increase and improve our mood and focus, as well as helping to manage stress and also overcoming mental health challenges around anxiety and depression. It can improve recovery in sport, but also sport performance itself. There are benefits in particular with the breathing technique for helping to manage chronic pain. And the one that a lot of people may have heard of is helping to regulate the immune system.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we will talk about some of the scientific experiments that have been conducted around that. But one thing I didn't ask earlier that I forgot was the breathing technique. When you are going into the ice bath, it's a little bit different from the technique you talked about before, but it's really important. So can you tell us about how you do that when you're about to get into the ice bath?
Sure. That's also a really good segue into an important safety reminder. So the breathing technique is not to be practiced in or near water, and it should be practiced somewhere safe. So like you would yoga, you're lying down on the mat, there's nothing around you. Practice it that way. So, and it's not I'm driving my car, I'm going to do some Wim Hof Method breathing.
No,
please don't do that.
Not.
and don't use it at the gym either. So, but having said that, so the breathing technique that you do as part of your breathwork training is different to the technique that you apply in the cold water into the ice bath. And what we're trying to do in the ice bath is shift from a sympathetic state. So when we go into the ice, it triggers a stress response in the body, which activates our sympathetic nervous system. And what we're trying to do is shift to the parasympathetic state. So we're doing that through controlling our breath. And that involves, pulling as many what I like to call parasympathetic triggers as possible. So that's inhaling through the nose with a long, slow, controlled exhale. And also when you're inhaling, breathing through the belly and really activating the diaphragm. And it's a combination of those things that help to put you into that parasympathetic state, help to activate your vagus nerve, which is intrinsically linked to that, and help you relax and regain control in the ice bath.
Do you know, and I have to attest that it really actually works, because I don't like the cold. I don't like being cold. When I signed up for the workshop, I thought, I don't know if I'll actually get in the ice bath. I might watch everyone else do it. But of course, when you're there, you want to do it. And I got in, and one thing you said to us, Kym, was to go in with confidence, which was really important to me because normally for something like that, I'd probably take ages. So I got in, and my initial response was the stress response, but Kym was right there, and he was reminding me how to breathe and to take that long exhale. And really, it's amazing. I think you almost have to experience it to believe it, but it really does work.
Yeah, and it's that control that we can have over our breath and the almost immediate result you see in it, not just in an ice bath, but wherever you're listening to this podcast from, just take a breath in and really a long, slow exhale. Do that 5 times and just pay attention to how your body and how your mind responds to that change in breathing. It just happens to be that we decide to take it to the extreme in an ice bath and really put it to the test. But it's fantastic to hear you comment on, that it was something noticeable that you could. Oh,
absolutely.
Could
I was
feel.
amazed, to be honest.
Yep.
And another thing that's important, I believe, is breathing through the nose. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So, look, I'm going to have to keep this one short because I could probably do an entire podcast based on nose breathing alone. It's a fascinating thing to me. And firstly, biologically, noses are for breathing and mouths are for eating. We've been evolved and we've been designed to breathe primarily through our nose. And unfortunately, the vast majority of us have become conditioned to breathing through our mouths, particularly during light to moderate exercise, particularly while we sleep, and for a certain percentage of the population, also our day-to-day. And we're really missing out on the benefits. So I'm just going to go through what some of those are.
Yes.
And, it's important to, with these benefits, you get this through nose breathing and you don't get this through mouth breathing. So first and foremost, breathing through your nose, it sterilizes and warms the air. All of us, as though we don't want to admit it, we have nose hair. We also have nasal mucosa, so that the mucus in our nose, and we have nitric oxide that is excreted in our nasal cavity. Those combination of 3 things help to protect the sensitive lung tissue, but they also act as antibacterial, antifungal, and antiviral agents, in particular the nitric oxide, so helping to stop large and small particles and bacteria, viruses, fungi from getting deep into our lungs.
Mm-hmm. So it's like the first line of defense then of our immune system.
Correct. Yep. That is exactly what it is. And when we breathe through our mouth, there's no filter.
We don't have it.
There's no nasal nitric oxide going down into the lungs. The other benefit of nasal breathing is that it helps us maintain body temperature and helps us prevent dehydration. So by breathing through the mouth, one study showed that we lose up to 40% of water loss through mouth breathing, which then unfortunately creates a vicious cycle. Our mouth dries out, we dry out, the nose dries out because we're not using it, and so we start to pant almost, and it leads to other health complications from that dehydration. But also, the nose helps to slow the flow of air in and the flow of air out, which helps us uptake oxygen better and also exchange carbon dioxide better as well. So it makes us breathing more efficient. From there, the breathing through the nose, and in particular the nitric oxide in there, helps to open up the alveoli in the lungs. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, so it causes the blood vessels, and in particular the vessels in the lung and the alveoli to open up. So we got more surface area there, improving that exchange of oxygen. Nose breathing also activates the diaphragm. There's a direct link between breathing through the nose and the diaphragm, our primary breathing muscle, being activated. So we're breathing fuller and we're less likely to get breath fatigue. A lot of us, if we breathe through our mouth, we breathe up into our upper chest and we start using our chest muscles, our intercostal muscles, so the muscles in between our ribs to breathe. And unfortunately, some of us even use our shoulders. They're not designed for breathing. And, we breathe 20,000 to 40,000 times a day.
Oh, right.
Depending on the activity that we're doing. And if you are using the wrong muscles that aren't designed for that purpose, you can imagine the toll that takes on the body. You imagine trying to ride a triathlon bike with your arms, right? That's essentially what you're doing with breathing with your chest as opposed to your diaphragm. The other thing that nose breathing does is it stimulates our parasympathetic nervous system that we just touched on before, and it's why we do a nose inhale in the ice bath. Interesting little thing. Inside the nose, there are a ton of parasympathetic nerve fibers.
Oh, right.
And when we inhale, our nose hairs vibrate as the air passes over, which triggers and activates the parasympathetic nerve fibers, which gives us that relaxation response to the body.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's very complex, isn't it?
The more I read and the more I learn about it, well, the more excited I get, but the more in awe I am of the human body, and the more I become to really be a firm believer in getting back to doing things in a natural state and letting the body heal itself and take back charge of its own health. Last quick benefit, like I said, we can talk about nose breathing for a long time, but the last very quick benefit is that breathing through the nose can help improve our sleep. So when we breathe through our mouth, the muscles in the back of the throat can get quite weak because they're not really getting used. This can cause a blockage to the airway.
Oh, right.
But also, when we breathe through our mouth, our noses are more likely to block. But when we breathe only through our nose, contrary to what the majority of people think, the nose won't block. So if you tape your mouth up and just inhale, exhale through your nose all day, your nose will not block. It will stay open through the carbon dioxide going up in there. So I hear this all the time. I'm like, there's no way I can breathe through my nose because it gets blocked. Hold your breath. Breathe in and out through your nose, and I guarantee you it will unblock, and you'll be like, and have a nice, clear airway to breathe through. So give it a go.
Two questions come to mind. Early on, you said we're conditioned to breathe through our mouth. Why do you think that is?
I think that we have, since the dawn of the industrial age, we've lost a little bit of touch with some ancient practices. So if you look at African tribes and Native American tribes, South and Northern America, they have these inbuilt understanding and almost intuition for the breath. So there's a lovely example in some Native American tribes where when the baby is young, so when we first come out of the womb, right, we're breathing in and out through our nose. At some point, the jaw's going to come open and we'll start breathing through our mouth. But what these mothers were shown doing is gently closing their babies' mouths.
Oh, really?
While they're nursing them and encouraging them and training them to keep their mouth closed. And so there's that aspect. We've sort of lost touch with it. Other things that come into play, and I referenced the industrial age, but things like our diet and our lifestyle create or increase stress. And where the mouth can be used to breathe is in the fight or flight state.
Sure.
But that's meant to be a short-term state,
right,
to help us, get away from danger or, complete some form of, intense physical challenge for a short controlled period. It's not designed to be in that state and breathe with the mouth 24/7. So there's a combination of factors, and, it's really great that, there is becoming more and more mainstream awareness thanks to people like Wim Hof, but also, other people. Some people may have come across a book called Breathe by James
I was
Nestor.
going to ask you about that. Yeah.
And he has written an absolutely incredible, super comprehensive book all around the breath. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast not too long ago, and that gets, hundreds of millions of views and listens. And that is only good for helping to bring attention to, first of all, raise awareness around the power that sits within all of us, that is our breath, and what good breathing can do for our overall health and our longevity.
So I'll put a link to that book in the show notes by James Nestor. What's it called again?
It's called Breathe. Quite literal, short, sharp and shiny.
Whilst we're on the topic of books, if you're looking for a good book to read to enhance your well-being, you could visit the book reviews page on my website, where I review well-being related books, and where you can also purchase those books by clicking on the link you'll see to Amazon. I'm holding the book Breath by James Nestor, the one that Kym just mentioned, in my hands, and I'll just read the first little bit of the blurb on the back. It says, "No matter what you eat, how much you exercise, how skinny or young or wise you are, none of it matters if you're not breathing properly. There is nothing more essential to our health and well-being than breathing. Take air in, let it out, repeat 25,000 times a day." Yet as a species, humans have lost the ability to breathe correctly, with grave consequences. Well, if that doesn't get you in, I don't know what will. So I will shortly be reading and reviewing that book. So please look out for that on my website, and I'll put a link to the book reviews page in the show notes. Recently, I listened to a podcast, The Physical Performance Show, by one of my favourite podcasters, Brad Beer, and he interviewed physiotherapist and exercise physiologist James Fletcher all about the science of the breath. And one of his suggestions was, very similar to what you've been saying, on a long, slow run he said, tape your mouth shut so you can only breathe through your nose. I haven't quite been able to come at the tape my mouth shut, but I have been trying to only breathe through my nose. And it's really interesting because it makes you realise how often you don't, because you have to concentrate on it.
Yeah, correct. And it's nice to hear that being recommended as a training technique. Just as a little add-on to that, if you've never ever done it before, I recommend taking Amanda's approach rather than taping, just holding your mouth closed and going on a light walk or a light training jog. And the idea with that approach is to maintain that pace, but more importantly, maintain breathing in and out through your nose. So if you get to a point in your training cycle where you're like, oh, I'm going to have to switch to my mouth, slow down, decrease the intensity, and maintain nasal breathing. So a lot of people don't like to do it because initially their performance is most likely to drop.
Yeah, you have to be going slowly. Well, that's what I found. And
it's an adaptation phase. Once the body adapts, that is when the benefits really kick in. And there was a study a little paper that came out showing that a triathlete, funnily enough, was able to maintain the same VO2 max nasally as he could breathing through his mouth. Now, I'm not saying that the first time you do this, you'll get it. This is a highly trained athlete that has been specifically focusing on that, but it shows you that with consistent practice, you can maintain a similar power output, and it may only be, for the last percentage of your run or your ride where you need to switch to mouth instead of right from the get-go.
Now that's interesting. And also nitric oxide is something, just off the top of my head, that athletes like because it's a vasodilator. So it brings more blood into your body and your muscles. So obviously, if you can breathe through your nose and you increase that, it sounds like it could be a beneficial thing.
Yeah, look, there's an important distinction between nasal nitric oxide and vascular nitric oxide.
I didn't know that.
No, and there's also it is a bit of a misconception, but it is why there are, nitric oxide supplements and things like this.
Beetroot juice and all that.
Correct. And that works on your vascular nitric oxide.
That's what I was thinking of then.
So the nasal nitric oxide, it's excreted within the nasal cavity and interacts solely on the the bronchiole, the alveoli within the lungs. Two different things, or two different locations, same effect. Dilates the blood vessels.
So it sounds like it's good for athletes. I just have to comment, Kym, if you were to tape your mouth shut, I don't know how it would work because you've got facial hair. It could be painful when you rip off the tape.
There is a certain element of pain that comes with it, but I use something called 3M micropore tape. It's like surgical tape.
Okay.
And you just stick it on the back of your hand and peel it off a few times, and it reduces the stickiness, and then put a small amount. And when we say tape our mouth shut, I'm not talking about like wrapping reams and reams and reams of tape around the head. Thankfully, we're just talking like a small, maybe inch-wide piece stuck on across the lips, either horizontally or vertically.
Okay.
But yeah, it is a downside for people with facial hair, but in my opinion, well worth it.
Do you get some strange looks when you're doing that?
So I only tape my mouth when I sleep.
Okay.
When I am training and exercising, I just close my mouth, because at various points, and depending on how you're feeling, unless you're highly, highly, highly trained at this, there's going to come a time where you've got to breathe through your mouth, and so I like to have that control.
Yeah.
And it's also good learning to close your mouth and close the throat, while still being able to breathe through the nose, and sort of creating a lock almost in your throat. So that's what I practice, and one of the reasons that I don't always tape my mouth shut.
Yeah. Also when you want to talk.
Correct. Sometimes I do like to interact with people at the gym, but weirdly enough, if I had my mouth taped, they probably wouldn't want to interact with me.
Probably not. So let's get down to some of the scientific evidence, because all these things sound amazing, but what's even better is that it's been put to the test scientifically. So perhaps you can talk to us about some of the more famous trials. There's one well-known study called the endotoxin study, which was performed on Wim and some others. So can you tell us a little bit about that, what the study showed, how they did it? Yeah,
sure. So there's been two endotoxin studies done on Wim and the Wim Hof Method. The first one was in 2011, and it was just done on Wim. The second one was done in 2014, and that was done on 24 volunteers.
That's right.
So what they do is they inject an individual with some dead bacteria, an endotoxin, which mimics a bacterial infection in the body. So you get things like nausea, you get a headache, your temperature's going to rise, you're going to be sweaty, and in general, you're going to feel bad and really unwell, like a little bad case of food poisoning almost. And so what they did in the first study with Wim, they got him to do his breathing technique, injected, and they looked at his blood, what was going on in there. And then that first study showed a massive increase in elevated cortisol, adrenaline in the body, but it also showed that the anti-inflammatory markers were decreased, and the anti-inflammatory markers were increased, and the pro-inflammatory markers were decreased in his blood. And what they suspected is that it is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system through the breathing technique, which sort of primes the body and prepares it and gets that immune system online. And the immune system, the part of the immune system that we're talking about here is the innate immune response. So the white blood cells, leukocytes, the release of the inflammation cytokines, etc. And it was thought up until that point that we were not able to voluntarily influence that part of the body, that was, done in response to the detection of a pathogen. And what Wim was able to show is that we can actually influence that at will, that we have access to our autonomic nervous system. And so, the first study was just done on Wim.
Yeah, so it was pretty groundbreaking. I think scientists were amazed, weren't they?
They certainly were, but some of them were also a little bit skeptical because the sample size of N equals 1, is it that, Wim is a genetic anomaly or not?
Exactly. Is he a freak of nature? So I guess that's what they wanted to test, isn't it, in the second study?
Yeah, so Wim went on Dutch TV to talk about the results of that first study, and he's like, look, what I can do, anyone can do. I can teach people within a week to do what I can do. Mm-hmm. And so the scientists were like, all right, we will challenge you to this. So in 2014, they got 24 people. They split the group. They took the half of the group to Poland for 10 days. And he put them through breathing technique. They were doing crazy things like, playing soccer in -20 in just shorts. They were swimming in waterfalls. They were hiking up mountains. They were doing everything that Wim had done. And then they brought both groups back to the same university, put them all through that endotoxin study. And lo and behold, the control group the trained group, showed a similar response to Wim in that they were able to dampen their inflammation response and, basically show that they could also influence their innate immune response like Wim could do. And from that point, it was, Wim made it his mission to, package up his technique and share it with people. And it looked exactly like you said. It was groundbreaking. Quite literally rewrote some textbooks.
It did, yeah.
There's a whole chapter in Biology Now textbook dedicated to Wim and the explanation of his method. And I think that is fantastic. And science is based on, what we know now. And it's a wonderful example of showing how scientific understanding can change over time.
Oh, absolutely. And science does evolve, and nutrition is another classic example of that, because really nutrition is such a young science and we're finding out more and more all the time. It's a really interesting space to be in. I think one of the things that I really like about Wim, obviously I don't know the man, but what he's doing is he's putting out a technique into the world that he thinks and knows is really useful. It can have some potentially huge public health benefits. He's not seeking fame, is he? But, in a way, it's sort of courted him because what he's doing is so amazing. And there's another well-known study based on Wim, again, to test whether he's kind of a freak of nature or not. And it's called the brain over body study. So can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, sure. So that was done, or it came out at the end of 2018, and it was carried out by Wayne State University over in the US. And what they were doing is they put Wim in a really fancy wetsuit that allowed them to fill it with either warm water, 34 degrees, or fill it with cold water to around 15 degrees. Mm-hmm. And then they put him in a fMRI and also in a PET scanner. So looking at what was going on physiologically during his breathing, but also in his brain. And they were trying to sort of understand, what is that?
What's happening? Yeah.
Exactly. Rather than just looking at blood work like some of the past studies had done. So some of the incredible things that came out of that, first and foremost, is that Wim was able to maintain a consistent skin temperature for 25 minutes when they cycled the water from 15 degrees up to 34. And he was also during his ice bath challenge able to do something similar. They had him hooked up to a whole bunch of electrodes, and at one point there I know we're digressing from the study here, but at one point during the ice bath world record attempt, he ended up his body temperature dropped into a hypothermic temperature range. He was then able to turn that around and warm himself up back to a regular, healthy, safe range. And ordinarily that can be quite tricky to do internally. Normally you need external sources, heat blanket, warm fluids, etc. So there's already something that piqued scientists' curiosity around how was someone able to do that. And so they, after studying Wim in the brain over body study, they came up with the hypothesis that obviously when we breathe, we're burning glucose. Oxygen and glucose together releases energy with a byproduct of carbon dioxide and water. So that burning, that consumption of glucose and oxygen produces energy, produces heat in the body. Also, like I mentioned before, that the first Radboud study saw a 200% increase in his oxygen consumption, which is a huge increase in the body's metabolism.
Yep.
And what they think is going on is that the muscle, the intercostal muscle, so the muscles in between your ribs, when they put Wim in the scanner, showed huge amount of heat and activity happening there. And they suspect because you are breathing actively, that those muscles are working kind of overtime. And because they are so close to the lungs and the blood flow, it's due to that contact that is helping to warm the blood up and help. Because the blood, obviously, all the blood passes through the lungs at some particular point. When you continue to generate that energy in your core, helps to maintain an overall level of blood flow. The other thing as well is they noticed the release of endocannabinoids, which are hormones within the body, and endocannabinoids are vaso and bronchodilators. That helps to improve blood flow.
Yes.
And there's that additional aspect that's going along as well, because in the cold our blood vessels constrict.
Yes.
So in our extremities. So it would mean.
So it's sort of counteracting that.
Correct. Yeah. So it's doing. What they hypothesized is that he's doing two things. He is counteracting the body's, or sort of overriding the body's natural response to the cold, and that is to constrict blood vessels. And he's also heating the blood up by his deep breathing techniques.
Yeah.
And what they also noticed is that in a part of the brain called the periaqueductal grey area, which is our pain modulation, pain sensor part of the brain, is that during the cold exposure, that became incredibly active. The control group, there was no activation of that periaqueductal grey area. So it's by bringing that online, it's almost like the technique is a stress-induced analgesia. So, that the body responds to the stress by helping us manage that stress a little bit easier. It's that helping to decrease the perception of a stress in the body. And the other interesting thing as well is that they noticed when the periaqueductal grey area was active, the insular part of the insular cortex, part of the brain, became inactive. Now, the insular cortex is responsible for self-awareness, for perception of emotions, for our body awareness. So by decreasing the activity there, I should say that the insular cortex is like that emotional cognition, so it to physiological experiences. So, it helps us recognize pain, it helps us recognize discomfort. So you put those two things together, and what Wim was able to do is, in response to stress, in response to cold, is decrease his psychological and physiological reaction to the pain, and also sort of switch off his emotional reaction to it. And ordinarily, these things were thought to sort of be, sort of out of our control, out of our influence. And why this study was so, I guess, influential in terms of informing opinions, it gave scientists some insight into the level of control that we can assert over our body
Yep.
and our brain that has potential far-reaching implications for people, in particular with mental health challenges,
Yeah.
anxiety, depression, PTSD, and that ability to really, through using physiological stimuli, to deeply influence the psychology and the workings of the brain and how we respond to stress. There's always going to be stress in our life, and
Yep.
on a side note, we need stress to grow and adapt. But what we can do, and what this study has sort of shown, is that we can learn to control our response to it, and we don't have to let it consume us.
It's absolutely fascinating. Really, it's what I think the space that Wim is in is really about the science of the mind, isn't it?
100%.
Yeah.
So he started off introducing breathing and cold to people, but where he is really pushing for now is everything about the power of the mind.
Yeah.
If you hear him speak, you hear him on a podcast, they're in the process of testing a brand new online course, for example, all around the power of the mind. And that is where it's going, where it's headed, because it is so intrinsic. We were talking again around the role of mind training, mental training in Buddhism, but it applies to other religions, other practices, and learning to influence and take back control of our mind.
What I really like about what we're discussing today is that it just shows us that if we pay attention to ourselves, to our minds, to our bodies, what we're capable of. And I think in this day and age, there are so many distractions out there that it's very easy not to do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's so important to have people like Wim out there who are really drawing our attention back to our own capabilities and our bodies.
Correct.
So I guess it's probably time to wrap this up. So Kym, can you tell us, apart from Wim, who inspires you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and really, first and foremost, it is anyone who's taken a hit, dusted themselves off, picked themselves up, and rebuilt and redirected their life. Second to that, the people that inspire me are those that are challenging, changing, and advancing the way we think about health and about our lives. And some of the people that immediately come to mind are people like Brian McKenzie, who's really leading the way with a focus on breathing and stress control, and that link between becoming more tolerant of carbon dioxide and the role that plays in stress in the body. A guy called Tony Riddle, he is all around rewilding our life. That is bringing us back to our natural state, natural movement, natural food, natural footwear. And on a side note, he is currently doing the 3 Peaks Challenge in the UK, but he is doing it barefoot.
Okay.
So he is, and he's doing it in 9 days. So rather than getting in a car and driving from peak to peak to peak, he's climbing the peak barefoot, running the peak barefoot. Then he's using barefoot shoes to run between the peaks, going again. And he's at day 5 at the moment. Day 1, he already broke his toe, so he was already behind the 8 ball. But I love his approach and, of bringing our lives and our lifestyle back to where we came from in a more natural way. The last person is a guy called Paul Stamets, and he is all about mushrooms and fungi.
Oh, yes, I've heard of him.
And I just love what he's doing around mushroom education. We're not talking about magic mushrooms here, although that's something that he talks about, but also the role that they play in ecology.
Yes.
The role that they play in the quality of our food that we harvest from the earth, and the role that they can play when we ingest medicinal mushrooms, as well as the pharmacological side of things for mental health. And so there's a couple of people off the top of my head that I really get a lot of inspiration from.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'll put links to those people in the show notes to their websites or Insta or social media. And finally, Kym, if you could recommend 2 things that people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be?
Sure. So number 1, by a long shot is to shut your mouth and breathe through your nose. Number 2 is to practice micro discomfort. So preferably in nature. And that can be things like, just doing short, small breath holds, taking a cold shower, swimming in the ocean, or even, walking barefoot to the shops. Just those little things that are uncomfortable but natural.
Yeah. Oh, that's great advice. And so, Kym, if people would like to follow you or attend one of your workshops, if they're based here in South Australia, how do they do that?
Yeah, simply Google Wim Hof Adelaide or visit my website, which is kymburls.com. So that's KYMBURLS.com, and you'll find me, my contact details, and a list of events and activities that I've got coming up.
So I'll put a link to that, obviously, and I thoroughly recommend the workshops. I loved it. It was really fascinating and a very well spent day for me. So thank you so much, Kym.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that you got so much out of it.
I did. Great. Thank you. And that was certified Wim Hof Method instructor Kym Burls. And I do encourage you to check out Kym's website where you can see all his workshops and courses that he has coming up. If you are interested in the breath, then I suggest as a companion episode to listen to would be my interview with John Stamoulis, an international breathwork practitioner. In that episode, John talks about conscious connected breathing, and that works on many different levels. At a physical level, it relieves tension and stress, and at an emotional level, it helps people connect with suppressed emotions and activates a natural healing process. So I will put a link to that episode in the show notes. Thank you for listening today, and I do hope that you found today's interview with Kym interesting or inspiring. If you did, please share the podcast and tell your friends about it. And if you could take a minute to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, it'll help people find my podcast. If you would like to subscribe to my podcast, Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, you can subscribe on all good podcast providers like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, iHeartRadio and Google Podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. So please follow me on Instagram and Facebook and check out my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com, where you can contact me via the contacts page. And if you'd like to, please suggest topics you'd like to learn more about and people you'd like to hear interviewed, and I will do my best to deliver that to you. Producing the podcast is a labour of love. It has become my full-time job, and I dedicate a lot of time, money and effort towards it. So if you do enjoy my podcast and would like to support it, I would be so grateful. You can make contributions via my Patreon page or via PayPal from the support page on my website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, so please do check that out. Another way you can support the podcast is by purchasing a book from the book reviews page on my website. If you click on the Amazon link there and buy the book at no extra cost to you, I will receive a much appreciated small commission. Thank you for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.